All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining me today. My name is Patrick Del Rosario. I'm the program coordinator for the Social Sciences Academic Resource Center. And for today, we're going to be talking about how to secure a letter of recommendation. This is definitely one of those topics that a lot of people want to kind of talk about nowadays because, or at least for this period of time, because now it's the summertime and everyone's thinking about their graduate school applications, and the letters of recommendation is a really big part of it. So I'm hoping that this is going to be really timely for some of you who might be in the process of actually asking for these things. Just to let you know that this is a webinar format. So if you do want to interact with me, as some of you have already chatted in here, you are able to chat, and you can also use the Q&A function. I'll go ahead and be addressing all of those questions at the end of the presentation. So I might not be looking at anything in the chat as we're moving forward, but please feel free to look into it, and then I'll kind of, or to insert something in there, and I'll go ahead and look back on it again as we go forward. All right, so with that all of the way, let's go ahead and talk about letters of recommendation. So before we talk about the actual securing part of it and just kind of everything about it, let's go ahead and just quickly define it just to make sure that we're all on the same page and just kind of make sure that we understand what the letters of recommendation are for. So basically, it's just a one-page document that's written by someone that you trust that can highlight a lot of your different individual personalities or individual qualities or academic qualities, just things that kind of talks a little bit more about who you are. Because in comparison to like a resume or a CV, it's only going to talk about your professional work, research, and other accolades that you might have. But the letters of recommendation is something that can kind of expose you for who you are even further, right? So it talks more about your personal character, and it's something that people can write about your own personality and get the goals that you have, right? So most schools are going to be asking between 2 to 3 from faculty. Now, some things that people might ask questions about for that is like, well, do I have to have all of them from faculty? And for the most part, you're looking to get your letters of recommendation from them because really what people are using these letters of recommendation for is to determine whether or not you have the ability to do graduate school level work, right? And we'll talk a little bit about how does that actually combine together with research and all of those other things, because really when you have somebody writing a letter of recommendation for you, you want to make sure that they highlight your qualities to be able to do that kind of work. So as we're moving forward, we're going to talk about 2 main factors of securing the letters of recommendation. We'll talk about a general timeline and the materials that you're going to be needing in order to ask for the letter. And then we'll talk a little bit more about what is the process of building a relationship with people who you're going to be using as referrers. Okay. It's a relatively long-winded process depending on how close you are or how the connection between you and your referrer could potentially be. So we'll talk a lot about how that can actually develop and how the pandemic has changed the way that you could actually interact with people nowadays, because it kind of brought about a very interesting interaction that you can do when you're trying to connect with someone on a personal level. Okay, so first and foremost, we'll talk about a basic outline. The first thing that you want to do is identify the places where you want to apply. So typically in the entire graduate school process or in a job that you're applying to that might need a letter of recommendation of some sort or just a reference in general, you're going to be needing to figure out where you want to apply. Now, this workshop is going to be focused more on the letter of recommendation aspect of it, so we won't talk about that, but I just need to remind you all that it is something that you need to make sure that you have set up. The next thing you got to do is organize the materials that you'll need, and we'll go ahead and break that down a little bit further, and then you'll have to determine who you will ask. The one thing that you want to kind of take away from this, and I'm going to refer to it many times, is that when you're asking for a letter of recommendation, you're kind of looking at about like 2 months in advance to ask somebody to write the letter. It gives them enough time where it's not too early where they might forget about it, and it's not too late where they might not have enough time to do so. So 2 months is a pretty good timeline. And with that, we'll kind of move forward. So as you're going through this entire process and listening to this presentation, I want you to ask, who is it that can actually describe your potential to do graduate level work? And what that means is that if you've done a research project with someone, you have somebody who's a mentor, are you displaying your abilities to be a strong graduate student as you're going through that process? Okay. So here are some of the materials that you're going to be needing. It's going to be the resume and the CV. Now, there isn't too much of a difference between the resume and CV. The CV is kind of like an extended resume, where not only is it going to be including your education and your work experience, but it's also going to include things like research experience, any type of scholarships or awards that you've received, certificates, conferences that you've attended, and so forth. Some people ask of like in the graduate school process, am I going to be needing to have a CV? Well, in some cases, it's always better to have a CV, but you could also include some of that information on your resume if you don't happen to have a lot of those other things. So basically, you just want to kind of turn in any of those things. Now, this is going to be one of those materials that you're going to be needing to submit to a person who's going to be writing your letter. So that's going to be one of the items. The other item is a graduate school matrix. And this is an example of what that might actually look like. This is just taken away from an Excel document where essentially what it does is it lists all the different schools and programs and a program description of the places that you're applying to. And you'll also notice that there's some submission deadlines on here as well. So whenever you're asking for a letter of recommendation, if you have something like this that's set up so that your referrer can kind of look at this and they can see like, oh, okay, this is when it's going to be due and this is how I'm going to be turning it in. It makes it a lot easier for the process, right? So being able to organize this and make it easier for the person to write your letters definitely is a good thing to keep in mind. You can imagine that if you're asking for a letter writer to write 9 different letters for you, right? And each of those different letters have different deadlines, or they might have a different format because this just makes the process so much easier on the letter writer's hand. I mean, I know for sure that when I do these, and then somebody gives me a graduate school matrix, or if they don't, I try to request one so that way it makes it a lot organized for everyone. The other things that you're going to be needing is an unofficial transcript, a personal statement, and just a thank you email, right? The way that I've actually seen students do it now is that the thank you email is just going to be connected to any of the materials that they have sent. So if you submit or if you request for a letter and then a faculty says like, yeah, you can do that. Just give me a couple of these different items. You already have all of these things in place, right? Your CV, personal statement, graduate school matrix, unofficial transcript. The interesting thing about any of these materials that you're submitting to a potential letter writer is that all of these materials are going to be things that you'll be needing for your graduate school application anyway. So the beauty thing about this is that as you're applying to graduate school or wherever it is that you need to apply, you're already going to have these things in place. But essentially, by keeping them all together in like an easy to download folder or something like that in a Google Drive, you are essentially creating a graduate school portfolio. So anybody who just needs some kind of information about you, they're like, oh man, like I'm not really sure what to write or how I should write it. I need to have this thing as a support. You can just link them to this Google Drive. And then from there, they'll be able to kind of pick and choose the information that they need to help write for who you want. Okay. So, I mean, if you think about it, gathering the materials is probably the easiest part when it comes to getting a letter of recommendation, right? Because the more difficult part is actually identifying who is it that you actually want to write this letter and how are you going to develop that relationship, which is primarily what we're going to be talking about today. So overall, to close on this, whenever you're gathering your materials, you just want to have an idea of like, what can I do to make the letter writing process as easy as possible for the person I'm requesting it from? Okay. So going a little bit more into specific details about asking for a letter. Again, we're talking about 2 months in advance. But the thing is that what I'm hoping for is that you're actually developing your relationship with a professor even longer than that, right? So it's not uncommon for students to think about graduate school maybe in their 3rd years or something like that. And at that point, that's when students are also thinking about doing research, joining a research lab or something like that, right? But there are also going to be the cases where you've only met a faculty member in the winter of your spring quarter, and all of a sudden you're like, oh man, this person's really great. I want to get to know them a little bit better. Then you start meeting them in spring, and then that's when you start asking for the letter. So really, it just depends on the nature of how your relationship with a professor actually develops. But at the same time, you want to make sure that you include the faculty member in your entire process of the graduate school application. Okay, so when it means about like including them, you might want to find different ways of connecting to them. So this can either be through email, some kind of office hour, or a personal meet. So the thing is that as you're actually connecting to these faculty members, you kind of want to think about, okay, well, how am I supposed to start a conversation? And that's what we're going to be talking about in the next slide. So here we go. Reading the situation is something that's going to be really important, right? So developing a relationship with a faculty member can go in many different ways. And the one question that I always get is, well, how do I actually start that conversation? The easiest conversation that should be commonplace for a lot of people right now is that you can always talk about the process of applying, right? So if you can imagine that you're talking to a faculty member and you look on their faculty webpage and you notice that they're going to a graduate school that you're interested in, you might want to go up to them and say, hey, like, professor, I noticed that you went to this graduate school and I was actually thinking about going there. Would you have a little bit of time to talk to me about how that process went for you, right? Or you have a faculty member who has the same interests as you do. So then you would say, okay, hello, professor, like I'm looking between these two different schools. And I was wondering if you had any information about how can I choose which one is the best one for me to go to? Or if I'm applying to both, how do I differentiate between the two as I'm applying to them, right? The idea here is that you're trying to develop a relationship between you and the faculty, right? So imagine that you're still that third year and you're still looking for people to work with, or you're still looking for information about how to apply for graduate school. By starting off with this conversation about this is my process in graduate school, it gives somebody the idea that you are somebody who's intentional about wanting to reach a particular goal. And from there, you can make consecutive meetings with them, maybe on a monthly basis or a bi-monthly basis, or however often you want to meet with a person. So that way they're kind of on top of the types of things that you're doing. If you happen to also be working in a research project with somebody, then at the same time, you're also working with, you're working with a person who could potentially write that letter. But at the same time, they're also watching and observing the types of things that you're doing in the research lab. Okay. Now, you might think about like, okay, I need 2 letters of recommendation from faculty. So is it going to be proper for me to be able to ask it from someone who's like a supervisor or like an admin or somebody that I've worked for? Yeah, you actually can, right? So if 2 faculty are supposed to be like the bare minimum of how many letters of recommendation you're going to be needing, you could actually have one that's going to be a personal. And in the case that you don't have another faculty member to write, and then you have 1 faculty member and 1 personal one, or like 1 professional one, so to speak, it actually is okay to submit it. You might as well. Because when you're thinking about hierarchical structures of who can provide that letter of recommendation, it is more important to get somebody who actually knows you as an individual rather than, say, a professor that just knows you for getting it in their class. Okay. So when you're choosing the type of person that you want to ask, or that you want to ask for that letter, you kind of want to think about like, who is it that actually knows who I am, that can either talk about my personal qualities, my academic qualities, my potential for doing a job really well, or my potential for doing graduate school really well and allowing me to be successful in that time. The other interesting thing that you might want to consider talking to faculty is creating some kind of personal connection with them. It's funny because when I was talking to one of my graduate students, they were thinking about like, oh, faculty know that letters of recommendation is kind of like a common thing that happens whenever you're applying to school. So there's this minor expectation that you may eventually be asking for a letter if it's somebody who's mentoring you. So what is it that you can do to establish a personal connection? Maybe if you find somebody who's more than willing to speak with you, just out of their own volition, or they're just somebody who happens to be friendly, you could just ask them like, hey, like, tell me a little bit more about yourself, right? Or something in the conversation about graduate school might hint at something that's a little bit more personal that you might find interest in, like a common interest. The funny thing is that because we're in a remote environment, people are always thinking like, oh man, it's really hard to connect with someone personally because we don't know if they're going to be busy, or like, how do we make sure that they can respond to us? Well, the thing is that as we're coming back into this non-remote environment, we're all starting to come in person. All of us have this really great common ground where we can connect on a personal level, which is the pandemic itself, right? Before you even start talking about the graduate school process or anything like that, if they're open to it, you might even talk about, so what was it like working in the pandemic? How was your research during the pandemic? How did you survive during the pandemic? And then you have that kind of personal connection already, because like, when we were doing anything before the pandemic, it's kind of like, well, how was your research, right? And then let's just talk about the research. But now it's kind of like, here's the extra layer of like, how did your research work during the pandemic? Because this was my experience going through the pandemic as a student. So then you create that sense of personal connection. Now that's just one example as to how you could connect with somebody using, this potential traumatic experience that we've all had. So that way it's kind of like, oh, okay, there's something that we can kind of relate to on this idea. And like, we want to continue moving forward with our professional lives here. You'll also notice that sometimes certain faculty are going to be much more open to actually working with students than others. Like there's a couple students within or there's a couple faculty within social sciences that I know that really adhere to working with students. Like within social sciences, there's Professor Jonathan Louie. Economics, I know Brian Jenkins is one who's really good, who is really responsive to students, or Professor Michael Lee in cognitive sciences. Like there's a lot more, but those are just some of the ones that I know. Like you can reach out to faculty and see if they're more than willing to talk about your graduate school process, right? It's just that if you do add some kind of personal connection, or if you can kind of pick and choose, like as you're talking to a faculty member, like this is a personal detail that we can talk about, you kind of want to emphasize on that idea, or you kind of want to just bring it to light to be like, oh yeah, like we can talk about graduate school, but we can also talk about personal things too. That's kind of like the development of mentorship, right? You'll notice that some faculty would also ask like, so tell me about your family, or tell me about your life. And then that's actually them trying to get an understanding about who you are as an individual. So that way they see you as more than just the student with straight A's, but instead they see you as a holistic person. And then from there, they can also write about this person is a really good student, but at the same time, they've gone through all of these things to get to where they wanted to be, or they had a lot of these different struggles, or this is the type of successes that they're proud of, or anything like that. So essentially any type of personal connection you can make with a faculty member or a mentor, that's something that you want to be able to highlight in those conversations. Speaking of connecting with faculty through email or just trying to connect with them, bringing back to this idea with the pandemic, right? When you reach out to someone, we're often thinking like, oh, like maybe this person's going to be busy. I don't want to happen to bother them. That's the interesting way of thinking, because even before the pandemic happened or anything like that, there was always this perception that people are always going to be busy. So I shouldn't be contacting them, or maybe it's not the right time to email them. But what that does is it kind of gives you the sense that there's a perpetual busyness that you'll never be able to break. And thus, as a result, will make people not want to actually reach out. So one thing that I would hope to motivate you to do is that if there's somebody that you want to reach out with, or a faculty that you worked with in the past that you're not sure if they're willing to respond to you again, is I would just say, put that email out there anyway, right? If you've worked with them in the past, that's great. They're more than likely to at least read the email first before they even respond. If it's a brand new professor that you're doing a cold email to, just shoot it out there. You know, you never know who's going to be more responsive to the emails that you have for any information that you're going to be wanting to ask about. The only thing is that I've heard that after you send that initial email, if you don't get a response, people tend to kind of cut it off from there. But really what you should be doing is that after maybe a week's time, or if you're a little bit more hesitant to do it, maybe a week's and a half time, you want to send a follow-up email to that faculty member, so that way they can, get back to the email that they may have potentially read. One of the most common behaviors that I've seen with our faculty is that if they don't get back to you, chances are is that they've actually read the email that you sent them before. So if you send them a follow-up email, then there's a possibility that they might actually get back to you from that one. I think one of the cool tricks that you can really do is that when you send the email initially, send them the forwarded email. So forward the email that you sent them initially. And then in the forward, you might want to say something like, hello, professor. I wanted to follow up on this email that I sent a couple weeks ago, or in the example, I'm saying 1 week, right? So I wanted to follow up on this email that I sent last week pertaining to this research question that I have. Would you have time to answer it? Or like, can you give me a response? Okay. Other things. So that's kind of like good behavior. It shows follow-up. It shows persistence. It's something that can kind of give a little bit of an idea about what your character is like. But I think it's also important to kind of highlight what's going to be in that email as well as you're starting to write it. Okay. So when you first write any of those emails, you want to make sure that you just kind of introduce yourself, and you kind of want to just write in the body of the paragraph, like, hello, professor, I'm reaching out because I saw this on your portfolio. I was hoping that you can have a little bit of time to meet, right? Oftentimes when you're sending these emails, you're asking them specifically to meet. So in the case of summer up until maybe the beginning of fall, you're trying to ask for some kind of virtual meeting for Zoom, right? In the case that you also have the ability to meet them in person, if you're going to be going back to campus in the fall, or if you want to kind of see if they're willing to meet in person, you can ask them to meet in person as well. So if for some reason they don't have the ability or the time, or if you think that asking them for a meeting is going to be a little bit too time taxing, the one thing that you could also do is ask them if they'd be willing to just answer a few questions through the email, right? So then you can kind of see the connection here where it's like, okay, I tried to ask for a meeting in person or on Zoom, but it didn't work. So I'm going to have them answer a few questions. And then from there, if they are able to answer your question, you could also potentially open up to this idea where it's like, okay, so you've answered one of my questions, but I think this is something that needs a little bit more conversation. And then you can re-invite them for another meeting moving forward. So it's kind of like navigating the ways of communication where it's kind of like showing like, I'm interested in talking about something, but then because it's not working, I want to be considerate of your time. So just answer one of my questions. But at the same time, these conversations could be a little bit more deeper. So I'm thinking that we should probably reach out and talk individually for like a short period of time. And a short period of time can easily be like 15 to 30 minutes, depending on how much time you actually have or how much time you think that they're actually going to need because, this quote unquote perception of busyness, right? So there's a lot of different ways that you can approach that email, either asking for a meeting in itself, just having them answer a couple of questions for you, or you could just, follow up on a previous email that you've already sent. So you'll notice that here, even in the email that I'm giving you a template for, it's not necessarily asking for that letter of recommendation right away. It's more about asking for the development of a potential like continuous form of meeting. Now, in the case that you're actually asking for a letter in a shorter period of time, say it's your 2-month mark, you've worked with the faculty member in spring and you kind of need to get that information now. It could be something like, hey, professor, like we've been working for the past winter quarter or the past spring quarter. I think these are the things that are great. I was hoping that you can write me a letter of recommendation, right? In that email, you want to make sure that you also include some information about what you've learned through the process of working with that faculty member, things that you're interested in doing, or just highlighting some of the things that you've done together, either in the class or either on a project that you've done. So even if you worked on this is with the expectation or the hope that during the time that you're actually in the class, you're active in asking questions, you talk to them after you get to them or after the class ends, you're just trying to figure out ways to kind of get on their radar of somebody who shows initiative when they want to actually learn something or get something done, right? So there's a few different ways that you can actually approach that. So hopefully that's something that gives you an idea about how to actually start that relationship or start that connection with the faculty. So you'll notice that as you're thinking about the process of letter of recommendation, depending on where you're at, the earlier that you can connect with faculty, the better it's going to be because it allows you to work with them a little bit more deeply. It allows you to have more conversations with them, or it allows you to just be within their radar. So that way they can kind of think about like, oh yeah, this is a person who participated in my class a lot. And I recognize them just because of that detail, right? Reaching out. Oh yeah. And lastly, the other situation, right? So we've talked about situations where you had a faculty member that you just met, a faculty member that you've met maybe within a year. But what about the case where you're trying to talk to a faculty member or somebody to write a letter of recommendation for you if you haven't talked to them in several months, right? Some of you may be graduating right now, or some of you are already graduated. So there's this perception that once you're done and you've graduated from college, you can't reach out to these people anymore. It creates that same level of perception about like, if this person's busy, we can't ever talk to them ever again. That's not true. Like people that you've made a connection with are going to be more than happy to want to speak with you again. So with that being said, if there's somebody that you haven't talked to in about 3 months or so, in the case of pandemic, maybe over a year, it's always good to start your presentation as like a reminder of like things that you've done within that time period, or just things that you've been thinking about, or ways to kind of start engaging in that conversation. So for mentors that you've already been in contact with, obviously, I would hope you don't need to reintroduce yourself to that person. But if you are, it's just like, hey, like I was in your class for this time around. We had some really great conversations about something, or like, hey, professor, it's been a while. Hope you've been doing great during this pandemic. I wanted to give you an update about what I've been going through, right? Like I've wanted to give you an update on something personal or something academic or something that kind of humanizes you so that you're also not just asking straight up for a request. Oftentimes, though, in that kind of situation, I would ask to meet up with them first, go on a Zoom call in person or whatever it may be as we move forward. But kind of like getting them up to speed with everything that I've done since it's been a long period of time. I'm hoping that with your mentors or anyone that you've already started about the process of applying to graduate school or applying to something, It's the same thing when you're asking for references too, right? In general, because a letter of recommendation is basically the same process of asking for a reference. You can catch them up with everything that you're doing. And then at the end of it, because they're already aware of your professional goals or your academic goals, you could say like, oh yeah, and by the way, like I've been working on these applications. I'm at the point of asking for letters of recommendation. I was hoping that you'd be able to write a letter of recommendation for me, right? You'll notice that what I'm describing here is a lot of relationship building and just the commonplaces of how to actually connect with faculty. So there's a lot of nuance in it. And each person is going to be very different in the way that they respond to them. A lot of this depends on your ability to want to network with people. I don't like using the word network, but really that's kind of what you're doing. But you're developing relations, like working relationships with people, professional relationships with people where they can observe your abilities to do something. So essentially that's a lot of what it is, right? So to kind of summarize everything that we just talked about, really what you're looking at is you're developing a relationship with a professor or a faculty member. You're kind of working through the process of talking with them. You have all of your materials ready because you should technically you should be in the process of applying to graduate school as you're thinking about these processes as well. And then you move into asking the professor, and then if they have materials that they need from you, that's when you actually distribute the materials to them. Okay, so that's kind of like a good summary. I do see that there's a couple questions in here, so let me go ahead and respond to some of them because I realize we're at 3:31. Okay, so who qualifies as a faculty? Does it have to be a professor, or do academic advisors count? So faculty members typically are going to be the ones who are kind of teaching classes. So they're your people who hold master's degrees or PhDs. They're just the kind of people who run the courses. They're like professors. That's what faculty are. When you think about academic advisors, staff members, supervisors, or anything like that, that's going to be more of a professional reference, right? So your academic advisor could be someone who's like a mentor or an advisor. I can tell you that for myself, for my students, I am considered an advisor, or a mentor, right? And personally, I like using the term mentor. If they say like, what's your relationship between this person? It's like, I'm the mentor. Because that has a little bit more academic weight than simply just somebody who's an advisor or a supervisor, which is true. We do also still mentor our students. So hopefully that gives you an idea. How much information should we provide in the email to the professor to summarize what we've done with them or under their supervision? What's the limit? I think that depends on, just to be a little bit clearer, because I was wording to myself, if you're sending up a follow-up email to a faculty, to somebody who's going to be writing a letter for you, how much information should you talk about in that email? It kind of depends on the relationship that you have with a faculty member. So if you are, okay, let me talk about how I would write it, right? Initially, I would just write about one particular thing that was based on the last conversation that I've had with a faculty member, right? So it's like, hey, like I know like it's been a while since we last spoke. This is something that I was working on that we were talking about. Just wanted to give you an update about what I've been doing to either reach that goal or here's how I changed that goal. So you don't need to give like a full disclosure of whatever it is that you're doing because it could be a lot. It sounds like you have a lot of things that you might want to update them on. But to keep it short in an email, probably just catch up on a conversation that happened in the past. And then you can, when they actually take the time to meet with you or talk with you or ask you more questions about what they should write in their letter, that's when you can kind of expand a little bit further. And if they're asking for like a personal statement or something like that, hopefully all of that stuff is going to be outlined in the personal statement, or it's going to be a little bit more obvious in the CV that you're submitting to them as well. Okay. I'm a transfer student, and when I was at community college, a professor of mine advised me when asking for letters to actually write it and attach it to the same email asking them for a letter. Ones of how it would lessen their workload, have all the necessary information, they work well. Okay. I was speeding to that question, but essentially it's asking, some professors will request that you actually write the letter of recommendation for yourself. They will make edits as appropriate to their experience, and then they will sign off it. So it depends on the faculty, and this is mostly going to be a conversation that you should have with them. I don't think that the approach is to actually give them the letter and be like, hey, I wrote a letter for myself, would you sign it? I'm guessing that in this particular situation, it would be how I imagined it for asking this type of thing, where this type of request should be coming from the faculty member themselves, right? So if they're saying like, oh, you know what, I don't have a lot of time, could you actually write the letter? Then that's the point where you would write it. In some cases, actually, they would also say, hey, like, here's a, like, somebody else that you also work with is going to be one of the graduate students. So what they would do is that they would have the graduate student and the professor write the letter together. So then they would kind of talk a little bit, like sometimes you'll be working more with the graduate student than the professor themselves, right? So you'd work with the graduate student, they'd write part of the letter, the professor would write part of that letter too, and then the professor would be the one to sign it off. So it is something that could be a potential practice that you'll be doing. Hopefully your writing letters or your ability to write letters is going to be pretty good too. But that is something that could be the case. So hopefully that kind of answers your question there. What would you recommend we do if we plan to apply to graduate schools in 2022? Okay, but have already established a strong relationship with faculty will no longer have much contact from here on out. Well, here's the thing, right? And I just talked about this idea, like if you're graduating, it kind of makes you feel like you're not going to have a lot of contact with that person moving forward. I would say that you should try to establish maybe like a one meeting every 2 months or something like that. See if they're going to be okay with that. You know, like if you haven't had a meeting with them yet, and like it sounds like you're actually in a gap year right now. So if you haven't had a meeting with them yet since graduation happened, I would say within this week or the next week now, or next week, reach out to them at this point in time, because right now there's not a lot of activity on the administrative side. I don't think faculty members are doing much unless they're actually teaching summer classes. So now would be the perfect time to actually reach out to them and say, hey, professor, just wanted to reach out, see how your summer's going. Do we have time to meet? I actually have some questions about the graduate school process. Or I wanted to meet because, you know, there's this thing that was really interesting about our research that we've done in the past. See how that works. And then during that meeting itself, extend the ability to say like, hey, you know, I really like these meetings. I was wondering if we could actually meet even further, in the future. Like I'm going to be doing a bunch of stuff during summer, but I'm hoping like maybe in 2 months I can reach out to you. This is up to you to create that connection with them. So just try to make sure that you establish that and you're intentional about it too. Really quick, I'm just going to make a note that we're at 3:36, but I'm going to be here to answer as many questions as possible until at least 4. So if you have the time to do that, feel free to stay. Okay, could we ask a work supervisor in the same area of research you'd like to work in for? Yes, so this is going to be the that part of the letters that I was talking about, where it's going to be more professional, personal type letter. Now, what I mean by professional, of course, is just somebody who oversees you as a mentor or an advisor, or in this case, a supervisor. So yeah, it should. I would say as much as possible, you still want to have the 2 base letters from your presenters to be from a faculty member, but that's not necessarily the case, because if you don't happen to have 2 faculty members, I think it would still be much better to have a letter from a faculty you know, a supervisor or a professional reference who also knows you really well, as opposed to one faculty who knows you really well, and then a faculty who only knows you because you got a name, right? So the quality of the letter is also something that you need to take into consideration. As much as possible, try to have 2 faculty because you're applying to graduate school. But, you know, if that's all that you have, really that's all that you have. So just submit it anyway. If we plan to apply to graduate school 2 to 3 years after graduating from undergrad, how would be the best way to go, still securing 1 to 2? Yeah, so this is wildly similar to the response that I had before, where it was a matter of just maintaining that connection. See if you could set up a time period of like, you know, professor, it was great meeting with you. Can I meet up with you within 2 months? And then actually holding on to that request, and you are going to be reaching out to them for sure. Yeah, the hardest thing right now I'm noticing is just maintaining those connections, because it's a lot of work. I think some of the best relationships I've had with students or with my own mentors are mentors who reciprocate in the type of communication that you have. So like every 2 months, I would reach out, and then another 2 months, I would reach out. And then all of a sudden, out of the blue, the mentor would reach out to me 1 month after and be like, oh, hey, like I just thought of something. That's where you start developing that connection where it's a lot more personal, when the communication becomes a little bit more reciprocal, where they're wanting to actually interact with you as well. If you can get to that point, I'm sure that everyone would be more comfortable doing that kind of thing. But yeah, just try to establish a regular form of communication as you move forward into this. Where can you find the recording? So I did mention at the beginning of this that we are going to be sending this recording to you at the end of the day. Whenever this video renders, that's when we'll give it to you. But it's also going to be live on the YouTube channel for SARC. Okay. Let's see. If we have a good relationship with a grad student, like a TA, but not the professor, should we first reach out to the graduate student, the professor, to initiate the letter of conversation? For this one, you would probably want to talk to the TA, ask them if it's appropriate for them to write the letter for you first, right? Um, in regards to hierarchies of letters, I'm pretty sure grad students are going to be within the same vein as like a professional letter, right? Because they're kind of like still within the field, or there's still something that's related, but not necessarily going to be the same level as a faculty member. They might relegate to that situation where they're like, okay, well, like we'll write a letter. I'll bring it to the professor. They'll be the ones to sign it. Like it just kind of depends. So for this one, I would have you actually talk to the TA first, so that way you can get an idea if it's going to be appropriate to do it. Okay. Let me see if there's anything in the chat. Is there a difference between asking a letter from a core professor and a lecturer? You can see that based on the degrees that they have. Personally, I wouldn't think that there's too big of a difference. For some schools, they might think that there is. I don't know, but a lecturer can have a PhD, or core professor can have a PhD. Like they're all still professors, regardless. So it should be okay. If there's a professor we were thinking about asking for a letter of rec, but they are moving to another university, can we still ask them for a letter, or should we ask another faculty member? So this is the interesting thing, right? Because some people are transfer students and they have faculties and mentors who are at that community college when they move to UCI or whichever university they go to. If you can maintain that relationship with this professor, regardless of where they're at, and they still remember the relationship that you had, like the working relationship and your personal qualities, that's something that you want to hold on to. So I would say, yeah, it should, like it's going to be great. Who would know you better than a faculty that you've worked with for 2 years as opposed to somebody you've worked with one, right? So the idea is also like, if they do know your situation and they happen to be a faculty that is also out of the field. Some people also ask like, well, I have a professor in humanities who I'm really close with, but I'm applying to graduate school in law, or I'm like going to law school. Is that appropriate? Like, yes, it's appropriate, because again, the letter of recommendation is just checking to see if you're actually able to do graduate level work. Okay. Let's see here. What should I do if I want to contact with a professor who I know is busy, from friends, school? I'm not sure if my time is worth it. Well, first of all, as a faculty member, as somebody who works at the university, you would hope that they would think that as, as an educator, the students is always going to be worth their time, right? That's first and foremost. Second, you're in this meeting already, so of course you're worth the time. So go ahead and just send them an email, right? So again, just kind of talking about the process of how the emails might work. You send them an email having a request to have a meeting, or if you're bold enough to ask for a letter, you ask for a letter right away. But if they don't respond, send them a follow-up email like a week and a half later. If they still don't respond, send them another follow-up email, or create a brand new email chain. Like, I would say never give up, but if there's a point where you just feel like that they're not going to have time for you to do so anyway, then you can move on to someone else. You want to connect. So the way that you have this question worded, it sounds like it's not somebody that you know really well. I'm just doing it based on how it's worded. I don't know if that's necessarily true. But the other way that you can kind of engage a faculty member, if it's somebody who is brand new, try to find their office hours. Or it sounds like you have friends who know that professor. So if they do have a regular office hours, if they happen to be in that class, go to their office hours, even if you're not a student of theirs. You can let them know, like, hey, I found your office hours, and I wanted to talk about this particular thing because I'm really interested in connecting with you. That shows another form of initiative where you're actually going outside of the classes, outside of anything else, because you're not necessarily connected, but you're going to their office hours intentionally. So yeah, go ahead and do that. Definitely. And this is just a comment on everyone. All of you are always worth everybody's time if you personally think you are. And that's another reason as to why you should just reach out to anyone, because it is worth it. I would also say be a little humble too, but there's nothing wrong with asking, I think is a better way of putting it. Okay. All right. So, wow, that was a lot of questions, everyone. Hopefully that answered some of the details that all of you had questions about. Does anyone else have any other questions? Yeah, no problem, Francis. Well, I don't normally say names on here as I'm talking, but you're welcome. Any other final questions before we close this out? Okay. Well, before we actually do close this out, I will say that SARC is going to be open throughout the summer. So if you do have any questions about anything, really, so if you're writing your letters to, or you're writing your emails to the faculty and you need help, like, oh, like, does this sound professional or whatnot, or what other details can I add to it? You can send us an email. We do meetings through our website, SSARC. See what is it? SSARC at uci.edu. So you can go ahead and go to our website, click on any of those appointment things, and we can help you with that. In regards to the entire application process, we can also help you write your personal statements and statements of purpose, and look over your CVs and resumes and stuff like that. So if you are interested in getting any of that additional information, we can. Oh, that's an email, isn't it? It's sarc.uci.edu. SOCSI. I think it's socsci.sarc.uci.edu. Something like that. Website somewhere. You can also just look up SARC as the slide says. So, yeah. All right. Well, if there's no more questions, thank you very much for joining me today. I was happy to answer all of your questions and hope to see you all in the future. So, ciao for now.